Okay, I think it's going.
All right. We're back again, week number 2 of the History According to Pirates podcast. I'm just floating a name out there. And today we're talking about the 1960s. I'm Mr. Boughton, also known as Pat Mom. And specifically, we're focusing a bit on TV and sharing our research and personal experiences in some cases. And the first thing I wanted to float out in terms of how TV has impacted us and how in the 60s it was a big deal is the 1960 was the first live televised presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, JFK. And so what was particularly interesting about this one, and it's pretty well regarded as what won Kennedy that election, was this singular debate. And even through later debates that came up, Kennedy was said to have just, in terms of debates and how debates work, to have actually just lost the debates. But for the first time in election history, we see the actual physical appearance and the actual kind of looks and attitude of a candidate in real person in real time have a huge impact on it. And what's kind of interesting about this, the story of this debate is when Nixon entered the studio, he had almost come straight from the hospital because he had re-injured his knee and had been in the hospital for a day or two and was coming straight in, and he was not well rested. He was not in like top shape. And when asked about, the production crew was like, hey, do you want stage makeup? Do you want to put on makeup? Right off the bat, both candidates were like, no, I don't want stage makeup. I don't want to wear any of that stuff. Nixon refused, and Kennedy. But then in the last hour, kind of right before the debate actually started, Kennedy had his own private crew that did stage makeup for him before he went on. And so when they were both under the lights in front of the cameras, Nixon was looking tired and sweaty and kind of weak and garbly, and he wasn't as practiced and smooth at public appearance like Kennedy was. And like Kennedy was one of those guys who had spent a lot of time in the public light. He was kind of part of this, almost bourgeois, fancy life, socialite kind of group, where Kennedy or Nixon was less so. And so in that scenario, we see these two guys facing off, and it came down to Kennedy just being the more interesting look. He was smooth. He was just smoother. And it wasn't necessarily because he was the best candidate or winning the debates. He just looked cooler and felt more on top of it. And what's particularly interesting about that is it wasn't until 1978 that you saw the trend being set where, especially incumbent presidents, they refused to do live TV debates up until 78. That wasn't a norm until 78, and it was largely in part due to the fact that Kennedy walked up and was just so smooth and killing it. Yeah, Alex.
I mean, it's still one of those things that like make or breaks candidates right now, right?
Yeah.
It's like it goes from appearance, as this big visual medium, but then in just being able to think on your feet like that, right? It's so difficult to construct these responses, give it back, stay to your platform, stay to your base. As a politician, you're always trying to think on your feet right there. It is so difficult. And like now that is one of the big things for the spectacle that people come to those presidential debates to watch. And it's almost another form of entertainment in a way.
Yeah, Mark, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Kennedy was well dressed. He had a sharp tie on, and like Nixon was kind of drab, and it was kind of, black and white. And now we have a little bit of color. In fact, I remember in the 60s, color TVs were just being produced, and in the late 60s, our family got our first color TV, and that made a huge difference in how things are looked on.
Matt, what are you saying? What are you thinking? You're still muted there.
Sorry, I was muted. That's an old person thing. The term 5 o'clock shadow became very well known after the Nixon-Kennedy debate, because Nixon had a very distinct 5 o'clock shadow going during the debate. And, definitely it impacted the election, which was very, very, very close.
Why don't you inform people on what a 5 o'clock shadow is for those that don't know?
Okay, look at Mr. Johnson right now. It's where your shave starts growing back later in the day, about 5 o'clock, and you can kind of see the shave, where you shaved earlier. And Nixon had that going on pretty good.
Yeah.
Debate.
Well,
I never
it's
had a
also
5 o'clock shadow, but I always had like the 2-week wisp before my beard started to actually be able to grow. It's like, oh, it's been 2 weeks. All right, time to take that off. Time to take down
we
that
also
peach
started to
fuzz.
see there, like there was a metric that popped up where you could almost tell whether or not a person would become elected based on how much hair they had. Because after you started having more televised debates and television appearances, like we stopped having bald presidents. And that played a role in that public perception of an individual. And it all came down to that TV. What were you saying, Milan?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I thought 5 o'clock shadow was when the groundhog went outside and he looks.
Yeah, that's a different shadow fool. Now, so which actually brings up another point is really we're talking about television, the impact of television. Last time we talked about the impact of rock and roll in 1950s, but something that was coming about was how society was transitioning from a print media where most people got their information from either the newspapers or, if people in the 1920s and 30s was the radio. That was the big thing. Because of World War II, television, which probably would have come into effect more so during World War II, but because of the war, it gets pushed back. And it's not really until the 1950s and 60s where television really starts all of a sudden says, hey, the main source of information is going to come from the television, and it's more entertainment. In 1950s, you have a lot of entertainment television, but now you're going to have more in-your-face radical television and television that's going to be promoting anything that's going on in society, from the civil rights movement to rock and roll to everything. And it really is transformative. Now you talk about the debate where, we had always had debates way back in the Lincoln Douglas debates, but that was a senatorial. This is the first time in American history where you have two presidential candidates face off against each other in a national debate, and it's being televised. And that moment that was captured on television, people for themselves, they didn't read about it, they could actually see it with their own eyes. And Americans had to decide, do I want somebody like Nixon, who represented the old guard, an older man, sweaty, not under control, or the smooth-looking character, almost like a Hollywood type, unlike St. Patrick Jr. there, that people had to then decide, do we want to turn over this to a new generation? And that's, and in a way, it was played up by the Kennedy administration, and they were phenomenal on it. Now, that's how it was played on television, but then it also brought to the forefront that people could use television in a very, very powerful way. The civil rights advocates, they knew that if they could get people to see how African Americans were being treated by police, by whatever, then people would be more moved. And even now, people's they hear about issues, but not until they actually see it on television or clip it on the internet. All of a sudden, their opinions radically changes. Yeah. So that's
yeah.
So it's interesting you should mention, old guard versus, young, because Kennedy was only a couple years, I think, younger than Nixon. Nixon was not an old man by any means, but he looked like he was old on television, and he acted like he was old. And Kennedy portrayed youth and vigor, much like Mr. Mollahan up there, who's going by an alias.
Yeah, and then, Matt, remember that Nixon was associated with the Eisenhower administration, right. A very conservative old guard, and this presented a new opportunity for American people.
Well, one of the other interesting things about it too is that since that was the very first debate, about 70 million people watched that one, and in the 3 subsequent debates that were televised, it's pretty well regarded that Nixon won 2 out of those 3 debates. but there were 20 million fewer people to watch each of those debates than that first one. And so fewer people kind of were able to get that different perception of Nixon versus Kennedy in those debates.
Yeah.
And again, that's kind of that power of seeing it and tuning in.
Right. And then the people who actually heard the debate, most of them believed at that time that Kennedy, the ones who heard it on the radio, that Kennedy lost. The people who saw that debate is to know Kennedy won.
Yeah.
Which goes to show you the impact of television. And people knew that was television was a very powerful tool.
Yeah, and the important thing is, if it swings the vote by 1 or 2%, that's enough to sway an election, because most elections are relatively close. So 1, 2, 3% is huge.
Well, and that one debate swung it by about 7 or 8, because Kennedy was down 6 points prior to that debate, and then he ended up winning by like 1 or 2. Yeah.
Which then brings up another point: is what other impact did television have in America at that time? Maybe the other people can chime in and say, hey, what do you think, Mr. Norling, and then whoever's next after that.
All right. Make sure I'm not muted. Okay, very good. So the 1960s were a time of great upheaval in our country. We had the civil rights movement in full swing. The Vietnam War was getting started, and by the late 60s, that was well into full swing. It was a very unsettling time, and it was also a time where there was a lot of clash between, as we talked about, kind of the old guard and young people who were really asserting themselves. Television in the 1950s was very wholesome. It was very much the ideal family. Or another genre that was very popular in the 50s was the Western. You had shows like The Lone Ranger and Wagon Train, and Gene Roddenberry.
Bonanza,
of course. There was a man named Gene Roddenberry. He had been in the war, in World War II, been a pilot, I believe. And when he came back, he turned into a television writer. And he had this idea that through all this strife, this chaos that was going on in the world's future, you would have positivity. You would have, man would overcome all of these difficulties, and there would be no more war and poverty and homelessness and all these other things. And he thought, you know what, I should do a Wagon Train to the Stars television show. And that show became Star Trek. And I don't think it's outlandish to say that Star Trek has probably been the most influential television show that's ever been on television. If you think about it, it's 55 years later, and Star Trek is still going strong.
Other than Pokemon Johto Journeys.
Indeed. So Mr. Johnson wants to say something. So I reserve the right to come back when he's done with his time.
I take a little bit of criticism with that Star Trek, because back in the 50s, most families had one TV. And so I watched what my parents watched. And Star Trek was not something that they watched. So I never saw Star Trek because my parents thought it was not a good show to watch. So I think that one family, one TV is probably foreign to anybody today, because most houses have 3, 4 TVs. People are watching different things. There's cable. We had 3 channels, plus we also had the local PBS channel. And most of us watched what our parents watched. However, maybe on Friday night we could watch a show that our parents let us, but we were controlled by our parents.
Oh, no doubt. So when Star Trek started, it was a show that was groundbreaking in many ways. We could talk all day about the scientific things, the idea of having, for instance, a flip phone communicator where you could talk to somebody holding it in your hand. I mean, that, with my background there, you can't see my phone. Okay. So things like that were...
I got you, Matt, right here. I still have one.
There you go. Things like that were very innovative, and they were science fiction ideas. But what made Star Trek so groundbreaking was the fact that it took on social issues as well. you have issues on pretty much every social topic just in the original series, which is the one that came out in 1966 and went through 1969. Only 3 seasons, 79 episodes. And since then,
Only 79 episodes. That's so bizarre to hear today as a millennial who's used to like 13, 15, 20 is a long series. Sorry for interrupting, but like,
oh, that's right.
Oh, no, 79 episodes.
The new series that they're having are like 10 or 12 episodes per season. But they're still making series now, and there have been, I think, 6 actual sequels to Star Trek, the original Star Trek. So Star Trek had the first interracial kiss. It had the first time where you had a multicultural main cast. It was the first time where you had, during the time of the Cold War, a Russian guy on the bridge of the Enterprise. Granted, he was not the captain, but that was for a number of reasons. He became a captain later. That's another issue. The one thing, interestingly enough, that Star Trek has been sometimes criticized for is they still had a tendency to put women in their place. So the women on the Enterprise, and by the way, if you look at my screen there, that's the bridge of the Enterprise. For those
wait. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Narling. Sorry to interrupt. When you say they put women in their place, can you please define what you mean by they put women?
Oh, I'm doing that now. I mean that, for the 60s here.
Okay.
The women on Star Trek on the original series had a tendency to be wearing miniskirts, have walk around and do the menial tasks, be the secretary more or less. And Gene Roddenberry did not believe in that. He actually had a woman first officer on a pilot episode of Star Trek. And he also had, as you probably have heard of, Mr. Spock, who was a alien, and he was also on the bridge. The network, NBC, was not ready to go that far. And they said to Roddenberry, you can't have both. You've got to either get rid of the alien with the pointy ears, or you've got to get rid of the woman, because the people watching this would not believe, as it turned out, they wanted the woman gone. They would not believe that a woman would be second in command on a starship. That was just unusual for those times. Well, so Roddenberry reworked it a bit, but I'm going to say two things here, and then I'm going to let other people talk, because I know I'm going on. And I could go on, believe me, I could go on for hours. Every student that I have that is watching this knows that. So 2 things. Number 1, there was a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise, Lieutenant Uhura. Lieutenant Uhura, at the end of the first season, she thought, I'm really not doing much. All I ever say is hailing frequencies open, sir. And she felt like her character was not equal enough, and she was going to quit Star Trek. And she was literally approached by a civic leader that shall remain nameless for this moment, who said to her, you cannot leave Star Trek. You are a role model for young black women in this country who are aspiring to actually be on a television show and be taken seriously. And that was Martin Luther King, who approached her and told her, you cannot quit Star Trek. And so
King was a Trekkie.
He was indeed. And then the other thing I would say is this. In later series of Star Trek, you have a lot of very strong female characters. So Star Trek has evolved from the 60s to the modern day, to the point where Star Trek Discovery, which is one of the new shows that's currently on CBS All Access, Star Trek Discovery, the lead character is a woman. And in Star Trek Voyager, which was on during the 90s, Captain Janeway was the lead character, and she was a woman. And in Deep Space Nine, you had several strong women characters, including Dax and Kira, who I named my cats after, but that's another issue altogether. So lots of really strong female people throughout. But in the earliest days of Star Trek, that was kind of a taboo socially. And so it moved on from there. And I'm going to let you guys say what you want to say, because I could talk about Star Trek forever, and feel free to ask me any questions. Mr. Mollahan, we'll go to you.
Well, I'm Mr. Simmons, as you can see. But what I've only seen a couple episodes, because when we got kind of prepped for this talk, we were kind of floating around the ideas of what we'd talk about, and Star Trek and its impact and power on society was brought up, and I hadn't seen any, so I sat down and watched some episodes kind of as homework for this talk. And one episode in particular that I really liked that I watched was from the original season. It's the 14th episode. Matt, what was the title of it again?
Balance of Terror.
Balance of Terror. And to me, like, I granted, my understanding of the Star Trek universe is pretty small right now, but just by watching that show, like if with knowing nothing about Star Trek, I was like, this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know, Matt could probably give you a synopsis of the episode a lot better than I could, but the way that the show was kind of exploring the idea that your enemy might not be a horrible person. And that got me thinking a lot about, you know, the Soviet Union and the United States. And when I get to my turn, I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis a little bit, but it was funny how just I randomly picked a couple episodes to watch, and this one episode that I watched, it might as well have been taking place off the coast of Havana and not, you know, by this neutral zone in outer space. And the other thing I was talking to Matt about that I thought was kind of phenomenal, I mean, because my wife and I watched the show, and some of the graphics look cheesy now, but I was sitting there thinking, like, how did they make some of those special effects work in the 1960s? Because at the time, that was groundbreaking stuff. Like, they had a shot where the ship kind of like dissolves because it has like a cloaking device. And I'm thinking, like, what kind of computers did they even use? Like, how could you get that kind of special effect shot? Like, so it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. I'm only a couple feet into Star Trek, but I'm appreciating it.
They weren't even using computers, man. They were like coloring the film directly, and a lot of that stuff got shot in Roddenberry's basement. Like, they were experimenting heavily, and kind of what I wanted to throw in is by them being groundbreaking, not just socially, they're being groundbreaking technologically speaking, where they were like, no one told us we can't do this with film. They using those new innovative techniques, they took kind of like the space genre, which existed already. I mean, we had things like Flash Gordon and other space adventures from before Star Trek, but what I loved about taking it as this futuristic space thing is, like, with Spock, he was half human, half alien. They got to explore the condition of multiracial people while taking it out of the human context, and it's still remaining personal, but impersonal enough to be easier to process. So a lot of these things that where they're tackling these social and political and major events, they did it in this context that allowed the individual to examine what was going on in just a detached enough way to make the brain be able to detach from its own biases on the scenario and examine it. Like the idea of having women of color on the bridge, or a Russian on the bridge, or examine this, you know, that episode was almost exactly the Cuban Missile Crisis. By putting it in outer space in the far future, people were able to look at the current event of the Cuban Missile Crisis in this impersonal way and kind of process the situation.
And I definitely agree with that. I love the vehicle that science fiction is for that kind of stuff. But a lot of shows at the time, especially when you think about the technology aspect, so take a step back for a second, that you're beaming these images into people's living rooms, even if, like Mark said, you only have one TV at a time. There is such a platform there to change people's minds and to try and push your opinion on them. Star Trek definitely did it. Star Trek pushed the boundaries in trying to challenge people's beliefs in their own homes, on their own time. And then you have shows like we talked about last week. Happy Days is a big one to show what this ideal kind of community is. You have all of these pieces of media coming in and expanding what people are thinking about. Now it's not just the newspaper. Now it's not just the political debates that you see on TV, but it is creative media that is able to push different ideas and challenge people's ideals of what they're doing. Mark, you had something to say on that?
Well, just similarly, like shows like Leave It to Beaver and Ozzy and Harriet were the idealistic life of most people, but unfortunately, it wasn't the life of most people. But that what Hollywood wanted you to see, and so again, most of television was produced by the white culture, and they try to promote that. Yet America is slowly changing, and you can see that in the 70s and 80s and 90s in how TV changes.
Definitely. And then like last thing before I transition to somebody else is like talking about all this stuff like when Star Trek first aired and when all these shows first aired, there wasn't a lot of television. And so there's a lot of reruns and there's a lot of repeating media out there. And the thing that was always changing was the 24-hour news cycle, which wasn't even 24 hours in the 60s. Nowadays, like flash forward from then with very little content to today where you have so much content on the internet and television that you could literally not watch the same thing twice for years. It's hugely expansive. And the kind of unity, the cultural, I in my brain, I'm thinking cultural cohesion. I mean, a lot of people are defined by that era of Leave It to Beaver, Star Trek, seeing, who's the big famous news anchor from that time period?
Walter Cronkite.
Cronkite, yeah. And like that's such a household name.
That's the way it is.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have all that stuff that kind of creates this unified idea of culture. And like Mr. Mollahan will tell you, the anthropologist in the room, that culture is everything learned and shared. And people were sharing a lot of the same media back then. Today, we have a lot of small enclaves and groups that define themselves on their genre or their chosen media they consume, which makes them entirely different from other people. But back then, much more unified because we were all watching the same thing.
Yeah, I think that it's a transition from the 1950s where television really reflects what the stereotypical, what America thinks it wants to be, the view of the dominant culture. And that's what it is from shows that Leave It to Beaver. Those are from a dominant perspective that people would want America to be, to a transition of what really is. And we see that more so really in the 1960s. And in Star Trek, I think the whole thing is to go where, what is it, no one's gone before? Is that what it is, Mr. Norling? To go with no one's gone before. But isn't it just to go in what respect? Now they're using the science fiction to get at the social issues. Where are we going to go on racial relations? Where are we going to go on other issues beyond the superficial entertainment aspect of it? And you see that in Star Trek, where they take episodes like you said, the first interracial kiss that is depicted on live television, to attacking other social issues of the time, America's foreign policy, to including various groups as part of their command ship. And not only was Star Trek going where, literally going where others had not gone before, attacking taboo issues of the time. And so we see that depicted there. But that's what television was going, and that's what people really wanted to see. I mean, you could only lie to the American people so long. The people wanted to see reality. They wanted television to reflect that which they were living themselves. And of course, if you're a television producer, you're going to sell that up. After all, it is a business. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, think about in the 60s how we started to see like real footage from the Vietnam War. Like people in their living rooms would watch people die in real time. Well, it was recorded and brought back, but like think about how World War II may have been different if that were, you could see the color pictures of people screaming in terror in ditches, and in the 60s we get to see that. And just, I mean, man, the seeing things with your own eyes changes things so much, and we can extrapolate that into today, kind of like what Simon was saying. In the 60s there was a TV per household, and now we have a TV per person in our pockets with
per room.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking like smartphone technology, right? You can watch a live broadcast of anything at any time.
One thing before we make this transition, that is so interesting to me. oh man, I had it, now I don't have it. Oh, watching people die on TV, like as horrible as that is, it's happening on the news cycle during this time period. And when we get a little bit farther on, I was wanting to talk about MASH, which is a satirical comedy version of the Vietnam War, or is it Korea?
Korean War.
The Korean War, which is, serious subject, something that we did not want to see. And people can get so burnt out watching the 24-hour news cycle today of all the awful things that are happening in the world. But when you see it through a comedic lens, or you see it through an entertainment lens, if you see violence that way, or you see heartbreak, trauma, all those things, entertainment can sometimes make a bigger impact on people, and they can sympathize more with those individuals. Like it's easier to connect with a fictional character sometimes. It's like cartoons for kids. It's easier to connect with those fictional characters sometimes because they embody a single emotion and persona rather than trying to deal with the complexities of human nature on the news cycle and TV.
Yep. MASH was
you haven't talked very much. I was going
Right.
to throw the ball to you.
Just a quick comment about something Alex said.
Sure, yeah.
About seeing those things on TV. The original Star Trek, I'm not even sure if there ever was any blood except for Spock's, which was green, because it was that was a taboo on TV in the 60s. And the irony to that is, when I was a little kid, I was born in '64, so I was a little kid when Star Trek came out, and I didn't even watch it until I was about in kindergarten, which was about the time it was going off the air. So my mom wouldn't let me watch it because she said it was too violent. So, but compared to today, probably not. Okay, Mark.
Well, to kind of
Mohan
change.
is on the line. Oh, good.
Okay.
Who's up? Who's talking?
Mohan
now?
is on the order there.
Okay.
I mean, if you got something real quick, go ahead. Mark.
No, I thought they were transitioning to me. Go ahead.
Okay, well, so it's kind of funny because I've got all these notes, and you guys totally are like, oh, let's take Patrick's idea about the optics of situations, and we'll just talk about it first. So I just seem like I'm coming out of nowhere, like coattailing you guys. What I'm thinking based on the conversation is it's all about optics and the power of the image. Roland Barthes was a very famous visual anthropologist, and he talks about that photographs in particular and visual media is not one way, it's a two-way kind of dialectic between what he calls the orator and the spectator. So the orator is the media that's being produced or the photograph that's been taken, but there's a whole other half to the image of what is the spectator doing, or what like, for instance, different crowds, different people take different things from different images. And when I think about this whole talk and this idea of the power of the image, I think that the civil rights movement and these Vietnam protests happened because of the medium of technology. I mean, if we go all the way back to the Civil War, I mean, you can bet black people wanted to protest that. You can bet that there's always been inequality in America. But I think that the civil rights movement really took off because, like you guys were saying, now you have a chance to actually watch it. Like my dad, who is 12 years older than Mark, talks about how in the 60s in northern Minnesota, where there weren't black people around, the first kind of impact that the civil rights movement had on him was watching black people in Alabama get hosed down by firemen, and seeing that on TV and having that be kind of a very fundamental impact on what this civil rights movement is really about. And then, so what I think is the reason that the civil rights movement is taking off, particularly in the 60s, is it was almost like a graph where the equilibrium was just right, where technology fit the needs. Because let's think about it. Like I said, inequality has always been around. But the technology gave the medium, because here's the thing, the people of color or the poor or whichever group that we're talking about that's been oppressed, they always had the need and the want to make their life better. But now, because of the optics, I think it was specifically white America, particularly the quote unquote good to do white America in the North, that could now watch the South. I mean, the South might as well have been another country to my dad in Rice, Minnesota. But the fact that he could see that on TV, I think that made a big impact, because I think for Kennedy and later Johnson and these other things, their momentum that they needed was from white voters.
My wife's from Arkansas. It is a different country down there.
Okay, very good. But like, you get the idea is that the atrocities that were happening in the South, whatever, they had to become a big deal to whites in the North. And the way that could happen was through this technology. So I'm very, very much in there. And this idea of Star Trek, I'm going to kind of hop around kind of theoretically today. This idea of Star Trek using the medium of science fiction, I mean, I liken that to the Bible. I mean, Jesus spoke in parables for a reason. I think there's a power in allegory that you don't get in a one-to-one situation. So I think Matt's really onto something with that.
Some people, like Mr. Norling, do treat Star Trek as the Bible, though. So
very good. It's the next testament, I suppose.
But there's so many people like that.
No,
Sorry
the
to
Wealth
cut
of
you off,
Nation
Pat.
by Adam Smith is the Bible.
It's so funny that like we define ourselves by our media today. I mean, some people live their lives based on the principles of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Patrick, and some people live their lives because they are shaped and molded by Star Trek or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's so many of these very powerful fictional stories that tell such a human story, and people define themselves along those lines. It's really quite
And I think
amazing.
we not only define ourselves, but we define history by this too. And here's what I want to get to mean. Let's look at Martin Luther King, who I think that we color history with rose-colored glasses with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was not as popular in the time.
Come on, then I'll give you a quick call.
It's every time Patrick is talking,
know, man.
It's every time.
Just shitting on me, man. You don't get to flip me off. I have waited my turn.
I have an itch.
I have waited my turn. Go to hell and read Adam Smith. Okay, so read The Wealth of Nations, or for you, The Poverty of Nations. Okay, so, all right. Now that I've asserted myself, I'm a 180-pound Irish gorilla. But now that I've asserted myself, and we look at optics again, and we're looking at Martin Luther King, he was not popular or as popular in the time. And I think that we kind of fictitiously give Martin Luther King all the credit of the civil rights movement. Like we kind of think that it was his movement, and we forget about SNCC or the SCLC and these other groups, and we kind of all give the accolades to King, largely probably because of the March on Washington, which was all kind of doctored by Kennedy, and many other black leaders even called the March on Washington the farce on Washington, because it was all made to be palatable. And who was it palatable for? White America. So I think the optics of the image, when we look at that two-way relationship, an image is whether you just took it or you had somebody stay in one place for the image. And I get you just like Pat. An image is created, and especially how you present an image is very much created. And I think that there's a reason for that. I have one other piece that I really want to get to, but I see that Pat Boughton and Jose have something to say. So go ahead, Pat.
Well, I was just thinking it's almost similar. King is almost similar to Kennedy in that regard, in like King's his own polished look and his good looks and his
I can't hear anybody
with oratory. Right, he had this very publishable persona that made him very digestible, kind of like Kennedy.
And even Rosa Parks was not the first black woman to refuse to give up her seat on a bus. There was a pregnant teen black girl who had done it, but they didn't want to make her the face of the movement because she was pregnant out of wedlock. So I think that there's some of that, and that kind of goes to what Matt was saying, how the 60s weren't quite ready yet for the level of female empowerment that say we have today, where we can talk about sex outside of marriage or children outside of marriage and these other things. Jose?
Excuse me. Which brings up that point is, where do people get that image? Now, sometimes it could be a book. Sometimes it used to be the radio, and now, or newspapers. But now, and the big thing about the 1950s and 60s is that image, and what people believe to be the case, is promoted by and seen through the television. We talked about at the beginning on the presidential debates and the importance of that and how people saw that. We talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Well, if people could hear the speech, it's quite riveting, obviously. But when you see hundreds and thousands of people marching outside of Washington, D.C., you say, this is some serious crap. These people aren't messing around. And then that image that brings them right to their living rooms.
And Martin Luther King even stressed especially that he wanted to get children in the front lines or interracial people in the front lines of the marches, and he wanted the police to fight back. Because now you have an image of policemen hosing down people, being German Shepherd. That looks way worse than saying, please go home.
Yeah, and right now, that hasn't really changed. To be honest with you, we just heard about an African-American being gunned down just recently in the news. What's his name? You guys know, the name just escapes me. And people had heard about this case, yet until the video was released, then all of a sudden it's caught national attention where you see two white people chasing down a black person. You can tell somebody all you want, but when they actually see it by themselves, it's going to elicit a different emotion. And that's the power of television and what it can do.
And I think that was part of that video that you're talking about specifically, Jose, was one that they had 30 seconds of footage of the actual murder. And it was horrible. And it was terrifying. And it was in a neighborhood. It was terrible. But recently they found 4 minutes of chase where these men, these two white brothers, chased this man through a neighborhood in a car and then stopped him, caught him, and killed him. And so it's like we talk about back then, this on its own is hugely powerful. Nowadays, it's like, how much of awfulness are you going to have to present to convince people of guilt? And so we're at a time now where it's like, 30 seconds of absolute violence and horror. Don't think that's quite enough for me. I'm going to withhold judgment. 4 minutes, we're getting there. It's so tragic that, in a way, it's tragic that that's the kind of stuff that happens today. It's like, I won't believe this until I see the video of the killing or of the awfulness that's happening. Back then, it was groundbreaking and terrifying. I mean, green blood on screen in Star Trek was like, oh my goodness, I can't see this. Now we have this stuff out all the time. It's crazy.
Yeah, whether it was green blood in Star Trek, red blood of African Americans being shed in the civil rights movement, the impact still the same later on. Crazy that people would have, a few people had color television, and the impact I think would have been even more significant was images of the Vietnam War being depicted on television. But you see that when Martin Luther King knows that, and people capitalize on that. But look at more recently in the LA riots, not that recently, but in the 90s, the LA riots, when Rodney King gets beat up and people see that live. And it's when people see those things that their opinion changes drastically. Of course, now we got the internet and things go viral. I mean, back then, that was the definition of viral, of what it is.
My meeting's starting again. Let me call you in about.
It says you're recording.
Okay, we'll just go with that, and we'll if
Why
my
can't
computer.
I do it?
That's weird.
It's so dumb.
Start off with your kind of subject you wanted to talk about, and get us started on that. We'll have a discussion real quick.
Well, I was going to.
We'll move on to final thoughts. I think.
I was going to
Hold on.
talk.
Hey, babe, I'm in the middle of something right now, and I was wondering if. What? We can get a pizza?
No, I was going to talk primarily about the bomb shelter, which I've already done that. And
I don't think you talked about it being recorded. And we'll move on to final thoughts. I think.
I was going to talk.
Hey, babe, I'm in the middle of something right now, and I was wondering if. What? We can get a pizza?
No, I was going to talk primarily about the bomb shelter, which I've already done that. And
I don't think you talked about it being recorded though yet.
Oh, we haven't recorded that yet?
I don't think so.
No, we did.
Was that after I
We
dropped?
talked about it a little bit after Alex dropped off, though. So,
Which is when the recording stopped.
right.
So if you want to rehash that conversation, Mark, I think that'd be for the best because I think we lost it
Okay.
when I got kicked. Yeah.
So tell me when.
Go.
Okay, I remember back, in the 70s when we moved to Yakima, that the house we moved into had a bomb shelter in the basement. And that was constructed in the 60s in fear of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And a lot of houses or homes had bomb shelters that were being built or constructed. You know, by the time we moved there in 70 and 71, we just kind of used it as storage, but it was a cylinder block 10 by 10 in our basement surrounded by lead to keep out radiation. Again, it was not uncommon for people to have a bomb shelter in their home. Did any of you guys ever witness that or remember
Yeah,
that?
the one I moved into when I moved to Yakima had a bomb shelter in it.
And did you go inside and look around?
Yeah, it had like a little ventilation pipe to the outside, and it was about 10 by 10 cinder block construction buried in dirt. In like a hole, they took up like half of the basement, filled it all up with dirt around this block of cinder blocks that they built.
That reminds me when we lived in
bomb shelters.
That reminded me when we lived in Missouri, we had a tornado shelter in our backyard, a big hole with it in the ground in case of a tornado. That's where you would go. But that again, that's a different story. I just remember of the 60s of things like Gilligan's Island. But I didn't really watch that live because, again, one TV, my parents wouldn't let us watch it. So I watched that in the 70s on reruns. Other shows that I kind of liked were Andy Griffith, Dragnet, Leave It to Beaver. Also, the Batman movies, when you had the visual on the screen where you go, wow, boom, pow. Those were the real Batman movies.
Absolutely. Adam West was the bomb.
Yes, absolutely.
So we may have had a bomb shelter, but we may have had an immigration shelter. I'm not going to tell you whether we did or not. But no.
He's threatening you.
Now, I mean, honestly, if you think about it, those bomb shelters, what would they do? I mean, the whole world, you're happy. And now what we have all these people with these shelters for apocalyptic individuals. They're thinking, hey, you know what? The apocalypse is here. Or people, they want to hide from the people coming back from the dead. It's like, really? This fear that gets promoted. And how much is that really promoted on television and the internet? To the point that people become really unreasonable. Some people think that we really, really, really are going to be able to survive some type of nuclear attack like that. And maybe that's a way for them to say, hey, at least now I am in control with this bomb shelter. Maybe that is what it represents to some people.
Milan.
Okay, I'll go real quick. I didn't get to say it in my time because I kind of went with something else, and that's okay. But one of the things that I really wanted to explore was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is kind of why there were so many, not just that missile crisis itself, but that's why there were so many of these bomb shelters and things.
Give us a real quick rundown. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Okay, so it was 13 days in 1962 off the coast of Havana. Basically, the Soviets, Nikita Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union, and Castro was the leader of Cuba, both communist nations. And there was this relationship where Castro saw the Soviet Union as his potentially only big ally because Castro's whole experience was that of imperialism. Like, he basically saw the U.S. as continuing this history that the Spaniards had done of imperializing Cuba, and he saw basically the United States continuing its extraction of resources and not to the benefit of the Cuban people. So the United States was largely his enemy from the Castro perspective. And basically there was, long story short, to try and wrap things up, because I know Mr. Norling has something important to say, the Soviets there were missiles, nuclear missiles, warheads that were in Cuba, and the United States Navy basically was doing a blockade of Cuba. They had surrounded the island, and there was this period of 13 days where the American ship and the Soviet ship were kind of staring at each other, and neither side was backing down. And it really came down. It was really interesting because it ties back into that Star Trek episode, because I can't remember the man's name. It was Vasily. Can't remember his last name, but that Soviet soldier saved the entire world because the Soviet command had said, When the American ships aren't backing down, fire, which would have started this mutually assured destruction. The Soviets would have launched all their missiles. The United States would have launched their missiles. This world would have blown up many times over. But that Soviet Navy soldier did not fire the missile. He went against his command to save the world, largely. And I tie this whole thing in, and I would have talked about Khrushchev much more because I think Khrushchev is super fascinating. And in that Star Trek episode, one of the main themes of the Balance of Terror episode was that your enemy might not be a terrible person. And there's this sense of duty. And I think one of the quotes from the actual episode that I wrote down was, in another reality, we might have been friends. And Khrushchev was really interesting. And I was talking to Mr. Boughton about this last night in our own conversation, that he wanted to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. He did not want the cult of personality, and he got rid of the Gulag and these other things. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, if we didn't have the American propaganda system, or if the Soviets didn't have their propaganda system, who was the real Khrushchev, or who was this real Vasily soldier? We probably don't get to see that because our image is limited in that relationship between the orator and the spectator here. Thank you.
Yeah, and to expand on that, I mean, I think we can tie that back into Mark's discussion of bomb shelters, where it's like that culture of fear telling you that all Soviets and Cubans are evil and they want to start a nuclear war. That culture of fear being pressed on you with this new medium of television is a very powerful tool to, not to be like conspiracy theorists, but it's a very powerful tool to the government. And it might have just been a circumstance that couldn't have been avoided. I mean, those news networks that pushed these messages of fear of nuclear war, of fear of the Russians, fear of the Cubans, it's good TV, and people watched it. And without that TV, would people dig thousands, maybe even millions of bomb shelters in their homes? Probably not. Would we have gotten to the point where we think that Russians are bloodthirsty, anti-American, want to take over the world types? Probably not.
In that Henry Wallace speech that I showed you from 1946, which was right after the end of World War II, kind of coming into Yalta and Potsdam, the vice president, Henry Wallace, gave a speech that said getting tough with the Soviets won't work because their entire history is of being invaded. And the mistake that Hitler made, for instance, is that he thought that there would be no commitment to the motherland. But that's all they know is defense of that. And so this idea of like getting tough with Russia in this Cold War will not work. And I think that's a really interesting speech because he wraps it up really beautifully. If you're interested in any of this stuff about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy or Castro or Khrushchev, there's a really great YouTube series. All you have to do is go to B. Castro or B. Khrushchev or B. Kennedy. And it kind of shows you how their upbringings and what they experienced as youth influenced how they acted during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the channel's called The Armageddon Letters, for those that are curious. It's really, really good.
I wanted to tag on to that idea of like the bomb shelters and how it almost makes me wonder, and I'm just sort of hypothesizing here, if this kind of like televised propaganda and televised fear mongering that took place and became more broadly spread was kind of that original seed of almost like the shop at home network kind of thing. Because think about how these propagandas, like with the bomb shelters that Mark grew up with, and I found in our house when we moved to Yakima, was an entire industry that got sparked, and how through the kind of massive spreading of fear and anxieties, you get into, these micro industries that pop up, filling these voids of people that feel that fear and anxiety, kind of like today with COVID, where I mean, just up in our living room over the past few months, my wife and daughters have made pushing 60 masks and sold them, and it's like, so here's this fear thing, and we've been profiting. I mean, we've intentionally not charged a lot of money. It's basically like, here's cost for a mask. We've donated a bunch, but like, where are the other places where that's not the case? And how, you see distilleries producing hand sanitizer, and so where scenarios like this, where you have the fomenting of emotions leading to profiteering almost, micro economies being born out of, I mean, think about doomsday preppers and how I'm a person on my YouTube channel. I do a bunch of like gear reviews. They're not the ones I'm most proud of, but they're my most watched ones because there's a bunch of preppers out there that are like, what's the coolest multi-tool to put in my go bag? Like, and
Like
it's
buying a
that kind of
generator.
mentality. Yeah. Like, and so doing things like that, it's really, it's fascinating to me how those kind of things, create economies around them. And
Like-
and I kind of television in the 60s as it expanded, I think was really kind of the foundation for those things to set and grow.
Another similar thing is like fear. It's like not all Muslims are terrorists. Very few are.
Right.
That whole, I mean, there's a lot of that, right? I was actually going to see if kind of final word we could like transition into this idea of 1950s, 1960s TV caused a lot of that fear mongering. In like the early 2000s, you see that come back again, kind of with the anti-Muslim stuff. But today, we're almost at a point where all of the fear, all of that kind of the blood cells mentality of national cable news and stuff, where it's like, and that not intentional fear mongering, but just the discussion of all the nastiness going on around the world has kind of gone a 180, where people don't take the media seriously and people are jaded and think like, I can't trust the big box office medias. CBS and Fox News and all these things. I can't trust these people, and so I'm not scared. Nothing is real, and I shouldn't care about anything. It's really interesting that people believed everything that was on TV in the early days of TV, and now with the internet and 24-hour news and all this stuff, a lot of people are disenfranchised with the idea that TV is at all truthful.
But if you can create fear, you can control people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things is the medium by which things are done, whether it's newspapers, whether it's the radio at one time. Obviously, right now we're looking at the issue of television, the internet, Twitter, and really a lot of these things are not new. These ideas are new. Is the method or the medium by which people with ideologies promote a certain viewpoint, and that is why it's important for the American people, the students, the leaders. They can either promote unity or they can promote division. Now, in the back, obviously, in the 1950s and 60s, there are some individuals that were promoting hatred for communism, hatred for socialism, more recently, hatred for others. Back then, there's also the others, the outsiders.
Yes.
Regardless of the time period. And then, but I think this is why it's so significant that our leaders promote unity as opposed to division. Now, however they go about it, they're going to go about it with Twitter or whether it is television or what have you. What they have to say and do is so important, and really potentially wonderful or potentially horrible.
Well, that's it. Like with the TV, it's almost like with every major communication medium invention, you have significant social movements that rise from them. Like thinking back, just like the printing press and how that it was able to spread out the Bible and pamphlets, and then we get things like the social movements in France, that led to the French Revolution. And then we have the telegraph, and then we had radio, and then the telephone, and then TV, and then cable.
The Game Boy Advance.
Yeah.
Mobile gaming is a great example.
all of these things, though, like have on their coattails significant changes in society that spiral after them. And it comes with and this is what I love so much about history is like macro psychology is each time these mediums come to prevalence, they expose individuals or groups of people to the other, and then these individuals or people have to reorient their worldview and sense of self and place in the world in response to the information that they have just received about what the world really is. Because, when you have the time where books had to be handwritten, bound in leather, only the most privileged few on the planet could even dream of looking at them, let alone owning them. And now we have this issue where all information is available at all times in our pockets. And like, what does that do to our sense of self and our sense of community? And so these historical events that we get to wrap our brains around are also these kind of like psychological things that people go through, and these historical case studies are also psychological and sociological case studies. That's what I love so much about all this. Like, they all get connected.
Patrick, you were really excited about something a minute ago. I want you to say it. I want to hear it.
Okay, it's actually about what you were saying. It's actually about what you were saying. So it's like super cool, like firing off all the neurons. So anthropologist Mary Douglas came up with this graph called the grid group model, and basically it's an explanation to explain why certain groups of people participate less in the hegemonic structure, either like voting or paying attention to the media or those types of things. And basically, the one axis of the grid is high and low, and the other axis of the grid is high and low in terms of fatality, and I don't mean fatality and death. I'll get to what it means in a minute. And the other axis of the grid, sorry, I'll focus it here. I don't know if anybody can even see this on a podcast. It's a box, children, whatever. It's a box!
Tilt it back a little bit so it gets light.
Okay, and then the other axis is about how much important the group is to you. But the most important thing is that I'm tying to what Alex is saying is, and I'm going to put it back up, is a fatalist is a person that has, it's low group but high uncertainty in their lives. So examples would be the elderly, peasants, the poor, people that don't feel like a part of the main system. And they're the ones that are really asking, what am I doing here? This system isn't for me. So if I feel in America, because there's so much coming at me right now from different news sources, and I don't feel like I'm really represented, my vote might not count, I'm not going to go vote. So those situations that in class we have where we're telling our students, hey, you have to go vote. Like you got to make your voice heard. A lot of our students are probably going to be in this section right here where they don't feel represented by society. No, I'm not going to care what the media says. I don't care what the presidential address said. I am not going to go vote. So Mary Douglas, if you're interested in it, I'll try to hold it. Maybe you can take a picture of it. It's a box, children. Boxes!
And so is the transition you're trying to get at that television and media, mass media, makes people move out of that box into the boxes where they feel included more?
I don't know if that's the case or not. I think kind of what I thought about when you're saying, Alex, is from what you said earlier, it's such a bombardment now compared to the unity that maybe we saw in the past, that now I don't know what I'm going to believe because none of it represents me or what have you. And you could even tie this to last week's conversation that we had about who's being represented and things like that. So kind of interesting to consider. And I keep putting Khrushchev off to the side. I always have these things about Khrushchev, and it gets pushed off to the side. Maybe next week, Khrushchev.
Well, and I'll piggyback on that for like a final word kind of deal, and that still ties in really well with what I just said. And it's like each time these mediums come and explode, there's a new version of what community is and of what these social boxes are, right? The ones that you do, where do you fit in? And it's kind of like when we, the last 5 or 7 years, there was such a huge discussion about like intersectionality and, what are the different groups and all things like that. And so it's kind of like the more and more voices you have pouring in, the more and more subgroups you're allowed to get. And therefore, the more and more confusion develops. And so you get more and more people being like, throwing the table, what does it even matter? Where do I even fit? No one fits anywhere anymore. And so we're kind of, just like we saw with the civil rights movement and TV in the 60s, there's more information, there's more voices. Comparing that now today, there's so much information, so many voices that you almost see that increase in fatalism now, because it's just like, where does anyone fit anywhere and why does anything matter?
Is it a big takeaway, Pat, that nothing matters and we should all be fatalists?
No.
No, the one thing that matters is next week I will eventually get to Khrushchev. But.
There we go. Mr. Garcia, go for it. Here's your final word.
I think really what matters is that we need to realize that we can play a role. We can play a role to be passive.
Dungeons and Dragons! We can play a role!
I got my D20. I got my D20.
I think you're playing the role. I think you're playing the role of fool right now, but that's okay. So we can play a role and help shape our own destiny and actively participate in the issues that are going on, or we let things happen to us, whether it be through voting, or not voting, you are still playing a role. You are playing a passive individual who says, you know what, this has nothing to do with me. Or you're saying, you know what, this may not have anything to do with me, or the powers that be are trying to keep me out, but I want to make sure I voice my opinion. Now, there's always going to be these individuals, hold on, there's always going to be individuals who have agendas. They're going to use the new medias to promote their programs. Your job is to be informed and say, I'm gonna drive the ship myself too. To use that Starship Enterprise there.
Matt, what's your final word?
I think we wanted to go ahead.
No, Alex, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, did you want to go last?
Yes, please.
Oh,
Malahan, give us your final word, final takeaway for the students.
Me?
Yeah. Or did
Oh,
you
I
already
thought
give
I
us
did with the whole Mary Douglas thing. So I guess I'm going to pick my last word is going to be a Desmond Tutu quote, and it is what Jose Garcia was saying. If you have chosen to remain neutral in instances of inequality, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So inaction is in many cases action. So even if we say we sit back and we do nothing, that means we're allowing something to happen. So get involved, be Mr. Garcia, and change your background picture to his picture.
Ubuntu,
by the way,
am because of you.
I did actually hear him talk at my college. He went to my college and gave a speech when I was at Occidental College.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Side note, that's the same place that Barack Obama went to college for 2 years before he dropped out because he couldn't handle it and went to Columbia. That's different. That's a little side note. Anyway.
My final word was going to be kind of getting back to a subject earlier because, like, I love this discussion, but to remind us where we started, and one of the things that I believe is really important as well, not to say that, not to disregard what you guys said, but the thing that always fascinates me about it is that if you look at media from the 50s, 60s, 70s, from the past, whatever it might be, there are nuggets of truth in that past that you can gain some insight into. The first season of Star Trek, like we said, is 79 episodes, but it'll transport you into the past while being a commentary on what the future might be. It'll show you the stresses of the times, just like today's media shows us a lot of the stresses of the here and now. And I think that's fascinating. I think that's a great way to get informed, like understanding, like we said earlier, I hope I'm not dragging on, but understanding earlier the stresses of the Cuban Missile Crisis is impossible for us today, having not lived through it. There's no way to get in touch with the idea that the world might end tomorrow. But you can get pretty damn close with Star Trek.
Mark and I are going to build a bomb shelter.
Things.
Mark and I are going to build a bomb shelter.
You get pretty close if you go to a bomb shelter. You sit there and you're like, this is what it feels like, huh? But anyway, that's my final word. Look to the past media for commentary about that time. Mr. Norling, finish us out, please.
So just taking the 1960s in whole. 1960 was when President Kennedy was elected primarily because of the influence of television. And besides dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of John F. Kennedy's great legacies is the fact that he said that by the end of the decade, we will send a man to the moon. And of course, Star Trek went from 1966 to 1969 and was all about man being in outer space and the optimistic viewpoint on the future. So culminating the 1960s, July 20th, 1969, people all across the world, not just the United States, but all over the world, were all watching the same thing on TV. Star Trek had already been canceled by NBC for low ratings. When Neil Armstrong stepped off onto the moon and said, this is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. To me, this is just the microcosm of the looking to the future, and all of what Star Trek represented, what John F. Kennedy represented to people. This was the culmination of it. Let's go be where no man has gone before. And so that's what I look at when I watch Star Trek or any of these other things, or even study history. It's how do we study history, but yet look to the future? Because what's important is not what happened. What's important is what's going to happen.
That's what Nietzsche says.
So that's my conclusion to this discussion.
Really good last word.
Why must we go to the moon? Because it is there.
All right, well, I like that ending. I think definitely everyone was watching the TV then. Okay, it's been fun. It's been great. I'm Alex Simmons signing out. If we just go around real quick, say goodbye, guys. It was good.
I'm Pat Bowden. Godspeed, y'all. Don't get eaten by a bear.
Matt Norling, live long and prosper.
Jose Garcia, do the right thing. Get involved.
Mark Johnson, don't hide in a bomb shelter.
Mark Johnson's subordinate, Patrick Malahan, duck and cover.
See y'all. Thanks for tuning in.
Okay, bye.